Officer Andrea Smith, a woman whose strength and ambition had earned her respect in a department that had seen its fair share of scandal. But Andrea's battle wasn't just with the criminals she apprehended, it was with something far more insidious. A danger that lurked behind closed doors. A danger no one had seen coming. What began as the crushing weight of unwanted attention from a superior officer would soon erupt into something far darker, a revelation that would expose the darkest corners of the Birmingham Police Department and shake its foundations. The city of Birmingham, Alabama, pulsed with an uneasy energy on that sweltering August night. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like an unwelcome embrace. In the heart of the city, the Birmingham Police Department stood as a beacon of law and order, its windows glowing against the darkness. But behind those illuminated panes, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the very foundations of justice and morality. Inside the precinct, Officer Andrea Smith sat at her desk, her dark eyes fixed on the computer screen before her. The soft glow of the monitor cast shadows across her face, accentuating the worry lines that had begun to etch themselves into her forehead. At 32, Andrea was a rising star in the department, known for her sharp mind and unwavering dedication to the job. Her chocolate skin gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her tightly coiled hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place, a physical manifestation of her controlled demeanor. But tonight, that control was slipping. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as she contemplated the decision that lay before her. In the reflection of her screen, she caught a glimpse of movement behind her, Captain Jeremiah Lois passing by her desk for the third time that hour. His gaze lingered a moment too long, a predatory glint in his eyes that sent a shiver down Andrea's spine. For months now, Captain Lois had been making her life a living hell. What had started as seemingly innocent compliments and lingering touches had escalated into full-blown sexual harassment. Andrea had rebuffed his advances at every turn, but Lois was not a man accustomed to hearing the word no. He wielded his power like a weapon, threatening her career, her future, and even her sense of self. As Andrea watched Lois disappear into his office, she felt a familiar knot of dread form in her stomach. She knew what was coming, another late-night summons, another attempt to corner her when the precinct was nearly empty. But this time, something inside her had shifted. The fear and disgust that had been her constant companions were giving way to a new emotion, rage. Her hand moved to her desk drawer, fingers wrapping around the small bottle hidden within. The antiretroviral medication rattled softly, a reminder of the secret she'd been carrying for years. HIV positive since a tragic incident in her rookie year, Andrea had never let her status define her or hold her back. She'd fought tooth and nail to keep her condition private, knowing the stigma that still surrounded the disease could derail her career faster than any misconduct. Now, as she contemplated the unthinkable, Andrea felt a strange calm settle over her. The choice before her was clear: continue to suffer in silence or take matters into her own hands. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Tonight, everything would change. Little did Andrea know, her actions would set in motion a chain of events that would rock the Birmingham Police Department to its core, exposing the dark underbelly of power dynamics and the lengths to which a person might go when pushed to their breaking point. This is not a story of heroes and villains, but of flawed human beings caught in a web of their own making, a tale of betrayal, revenge, and the blurred line between right and wrong. As the night deepened and the city slumbered, unaware of the drama unfolding within its police force, Andrea Smith steeled herself for what was to come. The true crime that was about to unfold would leave no one unscathed, challenging the very notions of justice and morality that the badge was meant to uphold. The Birmingham Police Department had always prided itself on being a tight-knit community, a family in blue. But for Officer Andrea Smith, that family had become suffocating, a pressure cooker of secrets and silent suffering. As she sat at her desk, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical force, she couldn't help but reflect on how she'd ended up in this impossible situation. Andrea had joined the force 8 years ago, fresh-faced and idealistic. She'd grown up in the Titusville neighborhood of Birmingham, raised by her grandmother after losing both parents to a car accident when she was just 12. The streets of her childhood had been tough, but they'd instilled in her a fierce determination to make a difference. Law enforcement seemed like the perfect way to give back to her community, to be the change she wanted to see. Her first few years on the job had been everything she'd hoped for and more. Andrea threw herself into her work, quickly gaining a reputation as one of the most dedicated and competent officers in the precinct. She volunteered for extra shifts, took on the toughest cases, and always went the extra mile for the citizens she served. Her superiors took notice, and promotions came quickly. But then, 3 years into her career, tragedy struck. Responding to a domestic violence call, Andrea found herself in a life-or-death struggle with a suspect high on PCP. In the chaos of the moment, she was stuck with a used needle. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits and tests. Andrea raised her glass, her fingers tightening around it as she forced a small, calculated smile to her lips. "To powerful allies," she said, her voice steady and laced with false charm. Lois grinned, his ego swelling at her apparent submission, and clinked his glass against hers. She took a sip of the whiskey, feeling the burn slide down her throat, but her focus remained razor-sharp. As he leaned back in his chair, basking in his perceived victory, Andrea subtly shifted her posture, allowing the plan she had crafted over the last 2 weeks to take root. Lois began to speak again, his tone dripping with condescension and unearned authority. "You see, Andrea, when you have someone like me in your corner, there's no limit to what you can achieve in this department." His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl, but Andrea forced herself to remain calm. She nodded, pretending to listen as her mind calculated every step.
"Of course, Captain," she replied, carefully mirroring his tone. "I've always appreciated your guidance and interest in my career." The words tasted bitter, but she let them flow, knowing they were necessary to set the trap. Lowe's leaned forward, his smile growing wider as he mistook her compliance for submission. "That's what I like to hear, Officer Smith. Ambition and loyalty. Those are qualities I admire most." Andrea took another sip of her drink, the whiskey dulling the edge of her nerves as she executed the next phase of her plan. "I've been doing some thinking, Captain," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that caught him slightly off guard. "About how I can be an asset to the department." "To you?" Lowe's raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening," he said, his tone oozing with satisfaction. Andrea reached into her pocket again, her fingers brushing against the pill. The placebo she'd prepared was harmless but visually identical to something much more sinister. She had planned this moment meticulously, knowing it had to be convincing enough to leave an impression. "I brought something tonight," she said, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "A gesture of goodwill, if you will. Something to show my commitment to this partnership." Lowe's tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Go on," he said. Andrea held up the pill, letting the dim light catch its glossy surface. "It's a little something to help you relax, to celebrate our new understanding." Her words were deliberate, her tone calculated to sound both enticing and innocent. Lowe's chuckled, clearly enjoying the idea of her playing along. "I didn't think you had it in you, Smith," he said, reaching out to take the pill. "You're full of surprises." Andrea watched as he placed it on his tongue and washed it down with a swig of whiskey, his confidence blinding him to any suspicion. She resisted the urge to flinch, knowing this was the moment that would change everything. The placebo would do nothing to harm him physically, but the psychological impact of what was to come would be devastating. Over the past 2 weeks, she had anonymously planted rumors and whispers about Lowe's in the precinct, subtle, insidious suggestions that would make everyone second-guess his actions and integrity. All she needed now was a trigger, a single event to unravel the carefully constructed image he had built. Lowe's leaned back in his chair, his smug grin still plastered across his face. "You've made the right choice tonight, Andrea. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Andrea forced a smile, her hands gripping the edge of her seat to keep them from trembling. I'm counting on it, Captain. As the minutes ticked by and the alcohol in his system began to take effect, Lowe's continued to talk, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Andrea nodded and played along, her mind already racing ahead to the fallout that would soon follow. When she finally left his office, her heart was pounding, but her resolve remained unshaken. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. She walked out of the precinct that night with her head held high, knowing that the days ahead would be challenging. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of control over her own fate. The events that followed would ripple through the Birmingham Police Department, exposing truths that had long been buried and forcing everyone involved to confront their own complicity. For Andrea, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where fear no longer dictated her actions and where justice, no matter how unconventional, would finally be served. Andrea felt her throat tighten as Lamar's words trailed off, his tone a mix of concern and unspoken suspicion. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her mind scrambling for a response that wouldn't betray the chaos swirling within her. I'm fine, Lamar, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. It's just been a lot lately, Captain Lowe's, everything going on. It's hard not to feel the pressure. Lamar studied her for a moment, his brows furrowed in thought. I get that. But if there's something you need to talk about, anything, you can trust me. I've seen too many good officers break under the weight of keeping things bottled up. Andrea managed a tight smile, nodding in what she hoped was a convincing manner. Thanks, Lamar. I appreciate it. But really, I'm okay. Just need to focus and keep moving forward. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but eventually gave her a small nod. All right. But my door's always open. Don't forget that. As Lamar walked away, Andrea felt a pang of guilt mixed with relief. He didn't know the half of it. No one did. And if she had her way, no one ever would. The next few days were a blur of tense silence and careful maneuvering. The precinct remained abuzz with speculation about Captain Lowe's condition, the officers' whispers growing louder as more details trickled in. Andrea tried to keep her head down, pouring herself into her work. But every glance in her direction felt like a spotlight shining on her darkest secret. The rumors swirled. Some said Lowe's had suffered a heart attack. Others speculated about an undiagnosed condition catching up with him. Andrea knew better. The timing was too coincidental, too close to the events of that fateful night. But she clung to the hope that his collapse was unrelated. A cruel twist of fate rather than the unthinkable. Then came the announcement: Captain Lowe's had been diagnosed with a rare infection, one commonly associated with compromised immune systems. The whispers turned darker, more pointed. HIV. AIDS. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. And Andrea's stomach churned every time they were spoken. Her carefully constructed world began to crumble. The investigation into Lowe's conduct gained momentum, with Deputy Chief Carter leading the charge. Andrea was questioned repeatedly, her answers carefully rehearsed, each word chosen to protect herself while giving the appearance of cooperation. But the stress was unrelenting, and her composure began to crack under the pressure. One afternoon, as Andrea sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Lamar. We need to talk. Off the record. Meet me after shift. Her heart sank. Lamar had been watching her closely these past weeks, his concern slowly morphing into suspicion. She knew this conversation was inevitable. But the thought of facing him filled her with dread. That evening, they met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Lamar waited for her in a booth near the back, his expression unreadable as she slid into the seat across from him. The waitress brought coffee, but neither of them touched it. "I'm not here as your sergeant," Lamar began, his voice low but firm. "I'm here as a friend. And I need you to be honest with me." "Andrea. What's going on?" Andrea's first instinct was to deflect, to insist that everything was fine. But she could see the determination in Lamar's eyes. He wouldn't be easily swayed. "Lamar. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I've been dealing with the same stress as everyone else." "Don't," he interrupted, leaning forward. "Don't play me. Andrea. I've seen you. You're not yourself. And it's not just the stress of the job. Something happened with Lowe's. Something you're not telling anyone." Andrea's hands clenched under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of her secret threatening to crush her. "I don't know what you're implying," she said carefully, her voice tight. "But I've done nothing wrong." Lamar's eyes softened, but his resolve remained. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Andrea. I need to know you're okay. Whatever happened with Lowe's, you don't have to carry it alone. Let me help you." His word struck a nerve. And for a moment, Andrea felt the urge to unburden herself, to confess everything and let someone else share the weight. But the risks were too great. Her career, her freedom, her reputation, everything was at stake. "I appreciate your concern, Lamar," she said finally, her voice steadied despite the turmoil inside her. "But there's nothing to talk about. Lowe's is gone. And I'm moving on. End of story." Lamar studied her for a long moment, his expression a mix of disappointment and resignation. "All right, Andrea. If that's how you want to play it. But just know, I'm here if you ever need to talk." She nodded, offering a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, Lamar. I'll keep that in mind." As she drove home that night, Andrea felt the crushing weight of her choices bearing down on her. The road ahead was uncertain, and every step felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it, no matter how uneasy it made her. The true fallout of her actions had yet to come. But Andrea knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. All she could do now was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that the storm she had unleashed wouldn't consume her entirely. Andrea tried to shake off the growing paranoia as the precinct buzzed with speculation. She reminded herself of the facts: her viral load had been undetectable for years, and the risk of transmission was negligible. Still, every whispered conversation and sidelong glance felt like an accusation, a reminder of the line she had crossed and the storm she had unleashed. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into Captain Lowe's spiraled outward, consuming the department in its wake. More women came forward, their stories painting a damning portrait of a man who had abused his power for years. The weight of their testimonies only added to Andrea's inner turmoil. She had wanted justice, but this felt like a runaway train, barreling toward a destination she couldn't control. Deputy Chief Carter held daily briefings, updating the department on the investigation. Each meeting felt like a ticking time bomb, and Andrea sat through them with her heart pounding. afraid that at any moment her secret might surface. But for now, she remained a respected officer, shielded by her role as one of Lowe's accusers. It was a fragile protection, one she knew could shatter at any moment. One afternoon, as Andrea was sorting through case files, her desk phone rang. She picked it up, trying to sound composed. "Officer Smith," she answered. "This is Detective Reeves," came the familiar voice. "We need you to come down to Internal Affairs. There's been a development." Andrea's stomach twisted. She muttered an acknowledgement and hung up, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. The walk to Internal Affairs felt like navigating a minefield, each step heavier than the last. When she arrived, Detective Reeves greeted her with a grim expression. He gestured for her to sit, his demeanor unusually somber. "We've just received the results of Captain Lowe's medical tests," he began. "I thought you should hear this from me before it spreads any further." Andrea's heart raced as she braced herself for the worst. Reeves leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Captain Lowe's has been diagnosed with HIV." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt the room tilt, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to process what she had just heard. Reeves mistook her reaction for shock and continued. "Given the timeline, it's likely that he contracted the virus within the past few months. We're looking into potential sources of exposure. But given the allegations against him, this complicates matters significantly." Andrea nodded mechanically, her mind racing. The chances were infinitesimal, she reminded herself. The virus had been undetectable in her system. But no matter how many times she repeated the facts to herself, doubt clawed at the edges of her sanity. Reeves' next words snapped her back to reality. "We'll be conducting further interviews with everyone involved, including yourself. It's critical that we get to the bottom of this. Not just for Captain Lowe's, but for the department as a whole." Andrea forced herself to nod again, muttering a shaky, "I understand," as she left the office. Her legs felt like lead. The walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of her secret pressing down harder than ever. The days that followed were some of the most harrowing of Andrea's life. Each interaction with her colleagues felt like a test, each glance a potential accusation. She threw herself into her work, desperate to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But the fear gnawed at her. What if someone connected the dots? What if Lowe's himself remembered that night in his office and implicated her? One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Andrea found herself staring at the bottle of antiretroviral medication on her counter. It was a lifeline, a symbol of the life she had fought so hard to build despite her diagnosis. But now, it also felt like a chain, a reminder of the choice she had made and the consequences she might never escape. She thought of the other women who had come forward, their bravery in speaking out against a man who had terrorized them. She thought of Lamar, his quiet concern and unwavering support. And she thought of herself, the woman she used to be, before fear and desperation had driven her to this point. The investigation continued, each new revelation adding to the chaos in the department. Captain Lowe's condition remained a closely guarded secret. But rumors swirled, each one more damning than the last. Andrea knew it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. Whether she could survive its fallout was another question entirely. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Andrea made a silent vow. She didn't know how this would end, but she would face it head-on. No more running, no more hiding. She had crossed a line. Yes. But she wasn't the only one. And when the reckoning finally came, she would fight to ensure that justice, not fear or guilt, prevailed. Andrea's life became a spectacle. A tragedy that played out under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The media had a field day, dissecting every detail of her personal life and painting her as a vengeful, calculating officer who had used her diagnosis as a weapon. The headlines were relentless. The narratives cruel: cop's secret plot for revenge, and HIV weaponized in police scandal. Her former colleagues distanced themselves completely. Their once friendly faces now cold and unreadable. Even Lamar Jackson, who had been her last remaining ally, couldn't look her in the eye. The department was in shambles. The investigation into Captain Lowe's behavior overshadowed by the sensational story of Andrea's actions. It seemed as though the entire Birmingham Police Department had turned against her, eager to cast her out and salvage what little reputation remained. The courtroom was suffocating, the air heavy with judgment as Andrea stood trial. The prosecution painted her as a dangerous, vindictive woman who had betrayed her badge and her oath. They called witnesses to testify about her behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident, twisting every action into a sign of premeditation. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to highlight Lowe's pattern of abuse, arguing that Andrea had acted out of desperation, pushed to her breaking point by a system that had failed to protect her. Andrea herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the harassment, the fear, and the desperation that had driven her to act. She admitted to her actions in full, her words raw and unvarnished. She made no excuses, only expressing regret for the harm she had caused. "I was scared," she said, her voice breaking. "I was scared of him, of what he could do to me and my career. I didn't see any other way out. I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't feel like I had a choice." Her testimony was met with mixed reactions. Some saw a woman crushed by systemic failure, a victim who had been pushed too far. Others saw a criminal who had taken the law into her own hands, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The verdict came down swiftly. Andrea was found guilty of aggravated assault and reckless endangerment, though the court acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of Lowe's harassment. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. It wasn't the harshest sentence she could have received, but it was enough to shatter the remnants of her life. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Andrea felt a strange sense of relief. The months of waiting, of living in fear of what was to come, were finally over. Now, at least, she knew her fate. Prison was a stark, unrelenting world. But Andrea adapted quickly. She kept to herself, avoiding conflicts and focusing on self-reflection. She attended therapy sessions, slowly unpacking the trauma that had brought her to this point. It wasn't easy, there were nights when the guilt and shame felt unbearable, but she clung to the hope that one day she might find redemption. The outside world moved on, though the scars of her actions lingered in the Birmingham Police Department. Captain Lowe's legacy was forever tarnished, his pattern of abuse laid bare for all to see. The department underwent a major overhaul, with new policies aimed at addressing workplace harassment and protecting vulnerable officers. It was a small victory, a faint glimmer of justice amidst the wreckage of Andrea's life. Years later, when Andrea walked out of prison, she was no longer the woman she had been. The idealistic rookie cop who had joined the force to make a difference was gone, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and deeply scarred. The world outside had changed, but she was determined to find her place in it once again. Andrea knew she couldn't undo the past. But she could try to rebuild her life. Piece by fragile piece. And perhaps, in doing so, she could find a way to make peace with the choices she had made and the person she had become. The gates of Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women creaked open, releasing Andrea Smith back into a world she barely recognized. The sun was bright but cold, its light highlighting the silver streaks in her hair and the lines etched deeply into her face. 5 years behind bars had aged her. But it had also reshaped her, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. She stood for a moment, taking in the crisp autumn air, feeling the weight of her freedom for the first time in years. Standing a few yards away was a familiar figure, one she hadn't been sure she would see. Sergeant Lamar Jackson, now Captain Jackson of the Birmingham Police Department, approached her with a cautious smile. "Welcome back to the world, Andrea," he said. His voice warm but tinged with sadness as he pulled her into a brief, awkward hug. Andrea managed a small smile, gratitude and apprehension warring within her. "Thanks for being here, Lamar," she said softly. "I wasn't sure anyone would be." Lamar gave her a reassuring look as he opened the passenger door of his car. "You've got more people rooting for you than you think." As they drove through the streets of Birmingham, Andrea gazed out the window, absorbing the sights of a city that had changed in some ways and remained stubbornly the same in others. The skyline boasted a few new buildings, but the neighborhood she once patrolled looked untouched by time. A mix of resilience and stagnation. "So, what now?" Lamar asked, breaking the silence as they neared the halfway house where Andrea would be staying. Andrea let out a long sigh, her gaze fixed on the passing streets. "Honestly, I don't know," she admitted. "My life in law enforcement is over. That much is clear. But maybe there's still a way I can make a difference." Lamar nodded thoughtfully. "You've always been a fighter, Andrea. Whatever you decide to do, I know you'll give it everything you've got." Over the following months, Andrea began the painstaking process of rebuilding her life. With the help of Lamar and a few old friends, she found work at a local community center. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She counseled at-risk youth, drawing from her own experiences to help them navigate the challenges of growing up in Birmingham. She also started running HIV awareness programs, using her platform to educate others and reduce the stigma surrounding the disease. Though she was no longer a police officer, Andrea found a new way to serve her community. She became a mentor to young women struggling with abuse and harassment, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale but as proof that it was possible to rise above the darkest of circumstances. Meanwhile, Captain Lowe's story had taken a very different turn. Andrea learned through the grapevine that he had retired from the force shortly after her conviction. His health had stabilized with proper treatment, but the scandal had ended his career and tarnished his reputation beyond repair. He had moved to Florida, seeking anonymity and a fresh start. It was a quiet, ignoble end for a man who had once wielded so much power. The Birmingham Police Department, however, was forced to confront its own failings in the wake of the scandal. The fallout had sparked sweeping changes, including the implementation of new policies aimed at addressing sexual harassment and abuse of power. A confidential reporting system was introduced, and officers were required to undergo training on workplace conduct and ethics. Though these reforms couldn't undo the damage that had been done, they were a step toward building a healthier, more accountable culture. For Andrea, the journey to redemption was far from over. But she was beginning to find her footing. The scars of her past still lingered. But they no longer defined her. She had made mistakes, devastating ones, but she was determined to use the lessons she had learned to help others. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment reflecting on how far she'd come, her phone buzzed with a message from Lamar. "Proud of you, Smith. You're making a difference. Just like you always wanted." Andrea smiled. A small but genuine smile. And put the phone down. The road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. She had been through the fire and come out the other side. Scarred but not broken. And now, she was ready to face whatever the future held. Mandatory sensitivity training had become the norm. And while it wasn't perfect, it was a step in the right direction. The Birmingham Police Department was slowly beginning to rebuild itself, shedding the toxic culture that had allowed abuse and misconduct to fester for so long. It was a long road. But progress was being made. 1 year after her release, Andrea Smith was settling into her role at the community center, mentoring at-risk youth and running HIV awareness programs. It was fulfilling work. But it didn't erase the lingering guilt and regret that shadowed her daily. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Deputy Chief Evelyn Carter, now Chief of Police, stood in the doorway of the center's main room, watching the bustling activity with a calm but thoughtful expression. Andrea approached cautiously, unsure of the purpose of her visit. "You've done good work here, Andrea," Carter said, her voice sincere as she glanced around the room. Andrea nodded, still unsure of where this was going. "I'm trying to make amends in my own way." Carter's expression softened. "What happened, it was a tragedy all around. But it forced us to confront some ugly truths about our department. About the culture we had allowed to fester." She paused, as if carefully considering her next words. "We're starting a new community outreach program, working with former officers to improve police-community relations. We could use someone with your experience. Your perspective." Andrea blinked, stunned. Are you offering me a job?" "Not as an officer," Carter clarified quickly, sensing her hesitation. "As a consultant. A liaison. Someone who's seen both sides and can help us do better." Andrea was momentarily speechless. She thought back to the dark days after her conviction, when she had believed her career and her ability to make a difference were over. And yet, here was an opportunity, not for forgiveness, but for redemption. A chance to turn her mistakes into something meaningful. Something that could truly help others. "I'll do it," Andrea said finally, her voice steady with resolve. As Chief Carter left the community center, Andrea stood by her office window, watching the city she had once patrolled. The Birmingham skyline was bathed in the warm hues of a setting sun, the light casting long shadows that stretched over the streets below. A new day was fading into night. But Andrea felt the spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She thought about the twisted, painful road that had brought her to this moment, the fear and anger that had driven her to make that fateful choice in Captain Lowe's office. The years of guilt and regret that had followed. And the work she had done to piece herself back together. This opportunity wouldn't erase her past. But it gave her a chance to make things right. To be part of the change she had once believed in so fervently. Gathering her things to leave for the day, Andrea caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was older, wiser, and scarred by life's battles. Yet in her eyes, There was a faint glimmer of the idealistic young officer who had once dreamed of making a difference. One day at a time, she murmured to herself, repeating the mantra that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life. With that, Andrea stepped out into the Birmingham evening. The streets were alive with the hum of commuters. The city moving on as it always did. Andrea walked among them, blending into the crowd, her steps steady and purposeful. For the first time in years, the future felt like more than survival. It held the promise of redemption, of making amends, of creating a legacy she could be proud of. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would always be those who doubted her, who saw her only for her mistakes. But Andrea was determined to prove that she could still make a difference, not with a badge and a gun, but with hard-earned wisdom and a commitment to prevent others from repeating the same mistakes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Andrea allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Another day had ended in Birmingham, Alabama. But for Andrea Smith, it felt like the beginning of something new, a chapter unwritten, full of possibility and purpose. The story of betrayal and loss had come to define her. But now, she had the chance to help write a different story, one of healing, second chances, and the long, difficult road to redemption.